My thesis analyzed portraits of Roman women from the 3rd century CE, focusing on how the contemporary historical and cultural context influenced the portrayal of women in art. My interest in the 3rd century was originally inspired by a research paper written for one of my art history seminars. The main subject of my paper is a marble bust of a young woman from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, dated to the mid-3rd century during the reign of Philip the Arab. While doing research for my paper on this object, I was intrigued by the realistic expression in female portraiture during the 3rd century. Therefore, I've decided to continue exploring this topic in my thesis. Roman portraits underwent significant stylistic changes in the 3rd century CE. 3rd century portraits of emperors were described by scholars as showing a resurgence of veristic style, based on those of the elderly Republican patricians. Meanwhile, female portraits from this period would also render with some degree of realism. Before the 3rd century, another resurgence of Republican verism occurred during the Flavian dynasty. However, compared with rather realistic portraits of the Fabian emperors and generals, realistic style was really used in portraits of aristocratic and imperial women, which were highly idealized with elongated body and elaborate hairstyles, imitating statues of Greek goddesses. This prompts the question of what are the implications behind this new interest in realism in the 3rd century female portraits. Unfortunately, previous scholarship focuses mainly on portraits of emperors, empresses, and non-imperial women who are rarely discussed. The purpose of my thesis, therefore, is to investigate how Roman women were represented in the 3rd century. My research focuses primarily on female portrait bust statues and relief portraits on sarcophagi dated from the Severian dynasty to the beginning of the Tetrarchy, covering the geographical areas of Rome and central Italy. I've studied 82 portraits and 27 sarcophagi in fragments from major antique collections in Rome, including the Capitoline Museum, the Vatican Museum, the Centrale Montemartini, and the Palazzo Massimo alle Termini. Through quantitative and visual analysis and careful historical contextualization, I investigate the possible causes behind the evolution of style and the relationship between portraiture of imperial and non-imperial elite women. From that perspective, I seek to offer insights into our understanding of the conceptualization of female identity through the art of portraiture. My first chapter is a brief study of the social cultural history of this period, which sets a colorful backdrop for the study of portraiture. The 3rd century is a period of extensive social change and instability, as the empire was facing both internal and external threats. A profound economic crisis, agricultural decline, and plague disturbed the empire from within. The Romans were also troubled by numerous threats of invasions at the frontier. However, it was also a period of immense cultural changes and a booming age of arts, religion, and philosophy, especially the early development of Christian theology and Neoplatonic philosophy. Most of all, one of the most interesting aspects of the 3rd century is the influences and the extraordinary power held by the imperial women, in particular under the Severian dynasty. Their sculpted portraits also established an artistic foundation for female portraits for the following decades. My second chapter started with the analysis of portraits of the Severian empresses, the most notable of which was Julia Domna, the wife of Empress Septimius Severus. The empress was originally from Roman Syria. She was renowned for her intellectual pursuit and as a patron of famous sophists, including Philostratus and Galen. Moreover, historian Tacitus reported that Julia Domna received delegations, answered imperial correspondence, and was put on civic office in Antioch while the emperor was away on military campaigns. The portraits of Julia Domna represent her with an intellectual quality. Her portraits in the Vatican Museum, as we can see in the middle, shows her down to her waist. She is turning her head to the right and eyes looking in the same direction with an affirmative gaze. Her eyes are enlarged with irises and pupils incised. Compare with the portrait of Faustina the Younger, the wife of Marcus Aurelius. The attentive gaze of Julia Domna draws our attention to her eyes, whereas the half-open eyes of Faustina create a dreamy impression that isolates her psychology. The portrait of Julia Domna, therefore, expresses a stronger sense of vitality. This can also be observed in one of her honorific statues, now in the Capitoline Museum. Her face is less smooth, and her converging eyebrows create tensions to the muscle on her forehead and her cheek with a strong psychological intensity. Both art historians Diana Kleiner and Paul Zanke have noticed that, compared with portraits of earlier empresses, the portraits of Julia Domna reject idealizing features in favor of a more practical realism. But her firm gaze and the subtlety of her consciousness in turn also give away a majestic and serene expression. The portrait style of Julia Domna was adopted by her successor, Julia Mamaia, the niece of Julia Domna and the later mother of Emperor Alexander Severus. Like Julia Domna, she had also actively exercised her political excellence in the imperial court. A portrait in the Capitoline Museum, as we can see on the right, shows her with moderate beauty, yet her furrowed brows and pursed lips attest to her concerns over the res publica. Having departed from the idealizing beauty of Faustina the Younger, both Julia Domna and Julia Mamaia assert themselves not only as the wife and mother of the emperor, but also as a main figure in the intellectual realm and imperial administration. Unsurprisingly, the portrait style of empresses were widely adopted by women from elite class, showing similarities in the format, hairstyle, and artistic technique, as we can see in the portrait on the right. The tension on her eyes also conveys a similar sense of seriousness as Julia Mamaia, creating a subtle juxtaposition against her smooth skin and wild model features. The following examples shows that realistic expressions were carried further in non-imperial portraits. A noteworthy example is the portrait of an elderly woman on the lower left. Her face is wrinkled, her eyes are weighed down by heavy eye bags. The folds on her forehead are also intensifying her frowning brows, indicating a sense of fatigue. However, the sense of spirituality displays on the face of the empresses is also incorporated into private portraits, which is conveyed through a contemplative or attentive gaze, accompanied by the movement of the head. As historian Michael Grant suggests, the disturbing turning of these heads and eyes reinforces the suggestion that the spirit can be detected behind and beyond its feature. The emphasis on the eyes and spirituality in female portraits during this period, therefore, constitute a new sense of realism in Roman portraiture, that is, the expression of the mind and the presence of the soul. This new artistic interest and expression are strikingly demonstrated in the damaged portrait of Princess Fulvia Plautilla. The princess suffered the damnation of her memory posthumously after the failed marriage alliance between her and Emperor Caracalla. Her portraits were destroyed and removed from all public monuments. Her surviving portraits served as a vivid testimony of this violence. As art historian Eric Varners observed, one of her portraits in the Houston Museum of Fine Arts suffered unusual mutilation. The eyes and right cheek have been violently gouged with a large claw chisel or other metal implements, which, he argued, is an anthropomorphic attack intending to obliterate the essence of the image, and the purposeful nature of the destruction is underscored with the remaining part well preserved. The imprint of violent actions targeting the eyes coincides with two major innovations in female portraits from this period, which are the delineation of the eyes and the spiritual quality expressed through the gaze. Both are typically found in portraits from this period. My next chapter focuses on how female portraits in the second part of the 3rd century are depicted. The legacy of severe empresses were carried into the period of the soldier emperors. However, classicizing styles was not completely abandoned. More precisely, the art of portraiture in the 3rd century is characterized by the concurrence of idealizing and realistic style. Among imperial portraits, we observe that while an idealizing style was favored by Emperor Gordian III and Gallienus, the portraits of Emperor Philip the Arab and Dacius adopt a more coarse realism. The concurrence of both artistic interest is reflected in private portraits. Meanwhile, there is also an early development of abstract style that presages the spiritual abstraction in the early 4th century portraiture. As we see in the portrait on the lower right, the drooling of the hair seemed to enhance the dimensionality of the head in order to soothe the awkward flatness. Moreover, interest in the eyes that started to develop in the Severan period was enhanced in the uprolling gaze in most female portraits, emphasizing the expression of the subject's state of mind and internal character. My last chapter includes the study of portraits and sarcophagi. Looking at female portraits and sarcophagi broadens our understanding of the representation of women in this period. Since the commission of busts and sarcophagi were restricted to elite members of a society, we can be fairly sure that portraits of women shown on both types of media were from roughly the same social class in Rome. Two of the main innovative features in portraits on sarcophagi are the introduction of philosopher and muse imagery and tondo portraits, which appeared mostly on strigulated and allegorical sarcophagi. Unfortunately, both types of sarcophagi have not drawn much scholarly attention in the past. The sarcophagus on the top is a strigulated sarcophagus with 3 panels showing figural reliefs. The central panel shows a man seated with a scroll and right hand bared as a Greek philosopher. A young woman is standing in front of him as a muse. She is raising her hand in the air in the gesture of play. The individualized figure of a man and a woman standing at either end are perhaps the portraits of a deceased couple. Their standing position also corresponds with the position of the philosopher and muse in the central panel, similarly representing their marital relationship with an emphasis on their intellectual life. This new imagery also appears on biographical sarcophagus, as we can see in the example right below. The central panel shows the woman, perhaps the wife of a man, represented on the side panel. She is fully clothed in the high mansion and showing and holding a scroll in her left hand, which could be seen as a symbol of her education. The side panel also shows scenes of learning. Man is represented twice, as the philosopher surrounded by his daughter and wife as the chorus of the muses. The philosopher and muse imagery, therefore, seems to praise the cultural learning of family life, where the education of women was upheld with equal attention as men. Moreover, the imagery of learned women also appears in tondo portraits. In strigulated and allegorical sarcophagi, individual portrait is often shown in a tondo, usually in the middle of the front chest. Women in tondo portraits are often shown holding a scroll in one hand.